Okay, the talk is about Wittgenstein and Qualia. It's really mostly about Qualia and only a little bit about Wittgenstein. Here's an outline of the talk. I will give some quotations from Wittgenstein, talk about two forms of the inverted spectrum hypothesis. Then I'll enunciate a principle I call the principle of normality. Then I'll mention a distinction of Sidney Shoemaker's between the intentional and qualitative content of perception. Then I'll give an argument that I call the shifted spectrum argument, and then an inverted spectrum argument. Then I'll mention an objection raised by Shoemaker and Stolnaker that Shoemaker calls the Frege-Schlick objection. Then I'll go back to Wittgenstein a little bit and then talk about memory. Okay, so first, the innocuous and dangerous inverted spectrum hypotheses. So I'll start from a quotation from Wittgenstein. These are from notes written in the 1930s that came out in 1968 in the Philosophical Review and have since been published in a more complete form in a book of Wittgenstein's notes on the mind. He says, consider this case. Someone says, it's queer. I can't understand it. I see everything red, blue today, and vice versa. We answer, it must look queer. He says it does, and E.G. goes on to say how cold the glowing coal looks, and how warm the clear blue sky. I think we should, under these or similar circumstances, be inclined to say that he saw red what we saw blue. And again, we should say that we know that he means by the words blue and red what we do as he has always used them as we do. So the idea is a previously normal person who uses color terminology in the normal way suddenly notices a huge change in his color vision, which he could describe, and also a corresponding change in which things look warm-colored and which things look cold-colored. Later on in these notes, Wittgenstein describes a kind of inversion that he's less happy about. He says, referring to the earlier passage, he says, we said that there were cases in which we should say that the person's... Now, the examples have switched. Instead of blue, it's green. I'll talk in terms of red and green. We said that there were cases in which we should say that the person sees green what I see red. Now, the question suggests itself. If this can be so at all, why should it not be always the case? It seems if once we have admitted that it can happen under peculiar circumstances, that it may always happen. But then it is clear that the very idea of seeing red loses its use if we can never know if the other does not see something utterly different. So what are we to do? Are we to say that this can only happen in a limited number of cases? This is a very serious situation. We introduced the expression that A sees something else than B, and we mustn't forget that this had use only under the circumstances under which we introduced it. So it was introduced when the guy says, oh my God, grass looks red and ripe tomatoes look green. So now he's questioning whether that same kind of terminology can be used if it were to always happen. Now, I just want to caution, the term dangerous here is my term, not Wittgenstein's. And I'm saying it's dangerous in the sense that it's dangerous for Wittgenstein's views. So I will be arguing that such a dangerous inverted spectrum case is possible, and a modified form of it is also possible. But there's a slight obscurity which we should immediately notice in what Wittgenstein is imagining in this dangerous case. Is it the peculiar thing happening over and over again? You know, people constantly wake up and say, oh my God, grass looks red. No, that can't be, because what he's thinking of is behaviorally indetectable. He says we can never know if the other does not see something utterly different. So it's not this. Another possibility is it might be that what you might think of as wires in the visual system are crossed at birth. So some people are raised seeing red things green and green things red. In which case, it wouldn't be peculiar in the same way, or at least not known to be peculiar. He certainly seems to be saying, well, he says, it seems if once we have admitted that it can happen under peculiar circumstances, that it may always happen, where of course he means not under peculiar circumstances. So it looks like something like this might be what he has in mind. But he doesn't say any more about it, and so it's a little difficult to know. What is the difference between these two inversions? One kind he's happy, or he seems happy to allow make sense, and maybe is possible, and the other kind not. Well, in the innocuous case, the subject says, grass looks red and fires look green. In the dangerous case, the subject talks like a normal person. In the innocuous case, the subject says, grass looks warm-colored and fires look cool-colored. The dangerous case, the subject says what we say. The innocuous case is localized. The dangerous case is widespread. The innocuous case is behaviorally different. The dangerous case is not behaviorally different. Now, except for the localized versus widespread, it looks like indetectability is what makes the dangerous case dangerous. But I will argue that indetectability is actually a subsidiary issue. That even a detectable inversion would raise the same problems that Wittgenstein is worried about. And to lead into this, let me introduce the notion of qualia. Qualia are contents of experience that are not expressible in ordinary language, for example, in terms of properties of objects, like looks red, sounds like thunder, tastes like beer. Okay? Qualia are in a certain way ineffable. I think the French word is inexprimable, is that right? Oh, wrong? Okay. The reason they're ineffable is because they are ways that things can look, for example, red. They're ways of looking red, ways of tasting like beer. And those ways themselves, and this is definitional, cannot be expressed in terms of properties of objects in this kind of way. Now, the crucial fact about the I claim the difference between the innocuous and dangerous case that is relevant to qualia is that in the innocuous case, at least one of the members of the inverted pair is abnormal. The guy who wakes up and finds that grass looks red, he's abnormal. In the dangerous case, inversion occurs among normal people. And that can be inversion. Normal people can be inverted whether or not they're completely behaviorally identical. So I claim that behavioral indistinguishability is not the key issue. And this leads me to what I call the principle of normality. So we can see the principle of normality by first considering the case that Wittgenstein considers. So we have one person who's normal. Suppose he says that red things look red to me and green to you, speaking to the abnormal person. Let's describe R as, let's use the term R, of course, not in a Wittgensteinian. Wittgenstein wouldn't approve of naming the type of experience, but I'm going to go with this. So I'm assuming inversion makes sense, and I will then be later giving an argument for it, but I'm trying to get the conceptual situation clear by assuming it. So let's use the word R to refer to the way a red thing looks to a normal person. So he has R. The guy who woke up one morning and grass looks red, he has the experience this guy has when he sees green. Okay, so the guy says, okay, something peculiar happened to me. Red things look green to me. So that's the case that Wittgenstein considers. But now consider this case, where we can no longer give R and G as names because these are cases where both are normal. So he says red things look red to me and green to you. But the other guy says, who says you are the one for whom red things look red? Neither of them have more of a claim on external terminology like red and green. So this is what I call the principle of normality. If normal people can be inverted, then we shouldn't suppose that color terminology applies to the experience of any one of them any more than the other because of this little dialectic. Both of them can say, I'm the one for whom red things look red. And sheer numbers don't count. We wouldn't want the way red things look to change if the minority suddenly became the majority. So that's what I call the principle of normality, which I will be using. Okay, now intentional versus qualitative content of perception. I am referring to a distinction made by Sidney Shoemaker. Now, again, I'm assuming the inverted spectrum is possible. So the case we've been talking about is we have two people looking at a red thing. They both say it is red, but this one has one experiential state and this one has another, and this one is the one this guy has when he sees a green thing. So then we would say the same intentional content, different qualitative content. The intentional content goes with what color is represented. Since both of them have experiences that represent red, they have the same intentional content of perception and different qualitative content. So if inversion is possible, you can make this distinction. Whereas if one is looking at a red thing and the other is looking at a green thing, they have the same qualitative content, different intentional content. So the intentional content is what you might think of as purely referential content. It's not. You could also say that qualia could be thought of as modes of presentation, but this would muddy the waters by bringing qualia into intentional contents. I mean, I think one could talk that way, but I think it makes things clearer not to talk that way. So I'll be talking about the intentional contents in a purely referential way, having to do with just the color that's represented. So if looking red applied to qualitative contents, we would have a vulnerability to error that we do not take ourselves to have. We do not think that whether someone stops at a red light because the light looked red to him depends on whether there are widespread inverted spectra. We think that somebody stops at a red light because it looks red to him, whether or not people vary in their spectra. In this, I am joined by, I think this is obvious if you make these, I think this is obvious. We do not take these cases to be so vulnerable, but I have an authority to quote, namely Frege. So here's an interesting discussion by Frege. So Frege says, the word white ordinarily makes us think of a certain sensation, which is, of course, entirely subjective. But even in ordinary everyday speech, it often bears, I think, an objective sense. When we call snow white, we mean to refer to an objective quality, which we recognize in ordinary daylight by a certain sensation. If the snow is being seen in a colored light, we take that into account in our judgment and say, for instance, it appears red at present, but it is white. Even a colorblind man can speak of red and green in spite of the fact that he does not distinguish between these colors in his sensations. He recognizes the distinction by the fact that others make it, or perhaps by making a physical experiment. Often, therefore, a color word does not signify our subjective sensation, which we cannot know to agree with anyone else's, for obviously calling things by the same name does not guarantee as much, but rather an objective quality. Now, I agree completely with this with one proviso. I think in a deeper sense, even when we use color terminology to apply to our own experience, it is, in a deeper sense, objective, because to say that something looks white is to say something like it looks to be white in the objective sense. We say something looks white when they look white the way white looks to us. But that is keyed to the objective sense of white. I think white is used to refer to an external color, and we only use it to refer to a sensation parasitically on its use to refer to an external color. So now I move to, so far I've just been assuming the possibility of an inverted spectrum, at least the intelligibility. Now I'm going to shift to an actual argument, not for an inverted spectrum, but for a shifted spectrum. Then next I'm going to give an argument for an inverted spectrum. So first the shifted spectrum argument. So I appeal to a few facts. First of all, there are, as everybody I'm sure knows, there are three types of cones in the retina. One that has a peak sensitivity in the longer wave direction, another medium wave, another shorter wave. They all three overlap, the curves overlap a huge amount, but the peak sensitivities are different. And interestingly, there's a genetic difference in the population of roughly 50-50. So probably half the people in this room are on one side and half on the other in the peak sensitivity of your long wave cones, your so-called red cones. And it's not a small one either. It's a fairly large one. Interestingly, males and females differ with respect to these. The reason is that it is an X chromosome linked characteristic, and men have one X chromosome, and women have two X chromosomes. And in the retina, which X chromosome is dominant happens randomly in each cell. So women are less extreme because they have two X chromosomes than men are, and so there's a difference in peak sensitivity on the average between men and women. Now, the reason I bring gender in is because I assume everybody will agree that men and women are equally normal. Likewise, I assume people will agree that races are equally normal, but there are also differences in sensitivity due to differences in macular pigmentation, which correlate with skin pigmentation. And then there are also differences having to do with the color of the lens and age. And I assume that people will agree that these differences are differences among normal people. So the whole idea of this is that there is variation in color vision among normal people. This, by the way, is a device used to measure your color vision. It's called an anomaloscope. And the idea is a person will mix two colors on one side to match one color on the other side. And the idea is different people, depending on these genetic differences and other differences, will make different matches. So the upshot is that there is variation in the neural basis of visual phenomenology that leads to variation in visual phenomenology in normal people. That's premise one of the shifted spectrum argument. Okay, premise two is that, well, premise two really has two parts. Maybe I should have made it premise 2 and 3. But part one is people have much the same color space. And this is shown, among other experiments, by what's called the 100 hue test. You give people 100 colored chips and ask them to arrange them in a color circle, and people give pretty much the same arrangement. Much more uniformity than there is in color vision itself, that is, considering all the variation there is in color vision. So it looks like people have pretty much the same color space, but they divide it up differently. However, social and linguistic influence sets boundaries of color terms, or at least affects them. In the U.S., Crayolas have had a huge effect. I don't know if children use these in France, but color terminology is made much more uniform, one can imagine anyway, than it would otherwise be without the standard colors in those Crayola sets. And then, there are objects like oranges that also constrain, or at least affect, color boundaries. So here's the shifted spectrum argument for Qualia. Normal people vary, this is the first premise, in color phenomenology due to variation in the physiology of color vision. And second, the needs of communication and cooperation affect borders of individuals' color categories. The upshot is that intentional contents of color experiences are almost certainly often the same, even when qualitative contents differ somewhat. Okay, so the idea is that something might look canary yellow to two people, but in slightly different ways. Same intentional content, slightly different qualitative content. Okay, so that's what I call a shifted spectrum. That there may not be, in fact probably isn't, a perfect match between the way we categorize colors, the way we give names to them, and the qualitative content of perception. So the idea is that, remember the thesis of qualia is the thesis that qualia cannot be completely captured in ordinary language using properties of objects like yellow or canary yellow. And so the argument is here that there are small differences in perception that are not reflected in the way people use color terminology. Of course, there are big differences in the way people use color terminology, but that is to some extent constrained by the need to communicate with other people. So that's the argument. So that's the shifted spectrum argument. So now I move to the inverted spectrum argument. So this is a bit more fanciful. So I'm going to do it in 3 stages. Okay, stage 1, we have a normal person at age 18. So I'll say there is a way that red things look are. He says it's a red thing, he's a normal person. Then this fellow answers an ad to have the wires crossed in his visual system. He's paid a certain amount of money. People want to find out what happened. So he answers this ad. He has this little operation. And after that, red things look green. And he says red things look green. So he notices the change, just like Wittgenstein's subject. Then the experiment is over. He goes home. He has to get along. They won't do it again. So he has to, get along with other people. He wants to call things by their normal colors. After so at first it's difficult for him. It takes time. He thinks he sees a red thing. It looks green. He's about to say it's green when he thinks, oh yeah, no, but I see red things green, so I better say it's red. After a while, this becomes automatized, and he gets along. He's a normal person, and he rarely thinks about the way things used to be. Many years pass, and there he is again at stage 3, at age 50. And someone says, aren't you the person who was the subject of that inverted spectrum operation? And he says, oh, yes. Yeah, and looking at this red apple, I remember what it used to look like before the operation. It used to look the way grass looks now, color-wise. So red things look the way they did at stage 2, namely G still, but he uses color terminology normally now. Then 10 years pass. He's 50 at this stage. The next stage he's 60. 10 years pass. He doesn't think during those 10 years about his early experience or any conversation before age 50. He does not discuss with anybody his operation. And then shortly before his 60th birthday, he gets amnesia for everything before 10 years ago, just after this conversation. Now, he is functionally just like stage 1. That is, he just calls things red. He doesn't remember anything about any color inversion. But we have reason to think that red things still look to him the way green things used to look. So he's inverted with respect to the first stage 1, but red things still look to him another way. Okay, so if you accept this, it shows that there are ways that red things look. People can use terminology in much the same way and still have different ways that things look. However, there is a problem with this argument. Namely, this talk of ways, which I introduced at the very beginning, is question-begging. I said there's a way red things look are, but gosh, doesn't that seem to be just assuming the conclusion at the very beginning? It doesn't seem right to do that. So maybe this isn't such a powerful argument after all, but luckily it can be rephrased to avoid that problem. So here's the rephrasing. Instead of there are ways that red things look, I'll just say red things look red. And then at stage 2, red things look green. Now even Wittgenstein had allowed that at stage 2, red things look green. right? You change the wires in his visual system, and Wittgenstein says, perfectly fine to say that red things look green. But if red things look green at stage 2, how can you object to the idea that red things look red at stage 1? The guy at stage 2 might even say, if he goes to his doctor and says, my God, help, red things look green. The doctor might ask him, well, have you always been like this? Or was there a stage at which red things look red? And the guy will say, yes, yesterday red things looked red. So you can't object to red things looking red. If you accept that red things look green, you have to accept that red things used to look red. So I don't think Wittgenstein or Wittgensteinian would have any leverage on this or this. But now this thing progresses in the same way. At age 50, he says the same thing. And here we can say that red things still look green, according to his old terminology. It's not the way he would put it. He now says red things look red. But of course, he's changed terminology. So it's reasonable to say that red things still look green, even though red things look the way green things used to look. Or we could say red things still look green. Sorry, we could still say red things look green, even though he speaks a new language. And then we have the same amnesia, and here, red things still look green, even though he calls them red. So you can do that whole story without any ways. But there is a new problem. Okay, so the new problem is stage 1 and stage 4 are both normal now. But red things can't look red to one normal person and green to another normal person, so there's a problem. So we can see that here. Here's stage 1 and stage 4. Red things look red things look green, but they're both normal. Well, maybe we should say that this guy's wires are crossed and therefore abnormal. But after all, it might turn out that half the population is crossed and half uncrossed. And I will introduce some evidence that that may be true. Or not half, but anyway, some people might be naturally crossed and some people might be naturally uncrossed. So it won't do to think of this guy as abnormal. So it looks like both are normal, and so we can't say that red things look red to him and red things look green to him. However, there is another way to revive the argument. And here it is. So this is my final version of the inverted spectrum argument. So red things look red at stage 1, red things look green at stage 2 as before. Red things look green at stage 3. But at stage 4, it's better to introduce ways and say red things look the way green things used to look. And in fact, we could have introduced ways here. And what we see is a bit of obscurity in talking about red things looking green when the subject is somebody who's undergone some kind of big shift. The idea is, when we speak of red things looking green, it's relative to some normal stage. But there are two normal stages, this one and this one. So there's something a bit problematic about talking about red things looking green when you don't know whether to relativize to stage 1, normal stage 1, or normal stage 4. So it's better not to talk that way at all. Instead we should say red things look the way green things used to look. So this is the final inverted spectrum argument. We can have stage 1 and stage 4, and at stage 4 red things look the way green things used to look at stage 1. So there are ways red things look that are not capturable in ordinary language in terms of properties of objects. And I should say not capturable in terms of properties of objects, even properties that could be introduced. So they're not capturable in language, except private language. Okay, so that's the inverted spectrum argument. Now there's an objection, which is that the operation makes stage 4 abnormal. But an operation can change one normal configuration into another normal configuration. Another objection might be that the adaptation makes stage 4 abnormal. But we can see that that isn't right if we look at a syndrome called transposition of the great arteries, in which an operation changes an inverted heart into a normal heart, but requires a period of adaptation. And this is described in more detail in the written version of the paper, which I think it's certainly available on the web. Actually, it's available on my website anyway. If you look me up in Google, you'll find it. Okay, so that is the argument and the reply to the inverted spectrum argument. What I want to now do is move to a consideration of an actual empirical syndrome which may result in something like a red-green inversion. It's not a perfect red-green inversion, but something like it. Okay, to understand this, you need to understand that we have these three kinds of cones that I mentioned in the retina. They feed to opponent process cells in something called the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is in between the eyes and the brain. The way color vision works is that there are these two opponent process channels, or really three. There's a there's a yellow-blue channel and a dark light channel too, but I'll just talk about the long-medium channel. So if the long-medium channel is excited in one direction, then the subject sees red. If it goes in the other direction, the subject sees green. And these are cells in the lateral geniculate nucleus. Now, it turns out that 14 in 10,000 people are what are called pseudo-normal. The combination of two genetic defects produces opposite pigments. And here's how it works. So, in the normal retina, we have these three pigments. Each cone has only one type of pigment. So, the pigment in the long-wave cones is erythrolabe. The pigment in the medium wave cones is chlorolabe. Now, it can happen that a genetic abnormality causes the subject to have erythrolabe in both, and those subjects are red-green colorblind. It can also happen that chlorolabe appears in both. Those subjects are also red-green colorblind. These are just two different kinds of genetic defects. It can also happen that a person has both genetic defects, in which case chlorolabe and erythrolabe are switched. So in the mid-wavelength cones, you've got erythrolabe, which is usually over in these long-wave cones. And in the long-wave cones, you've got chlorolabe, which is usually in the middle-wave cones. Now, if the relation between the cones and the opponent process system is hardwired, then you will have something like opposite activations of the red-green opponent process system. The reason I say something like is because there's also a contribution from blue. And I don't know enough about it to know exactly what that contribution from blue is, but I think it's clear that there will be a huge effect in the direction of reversing red and green if those connections are hardwired, and nobody knows whether they are. So we can calculate that 14 in 10,000 people are pseudo-normal, that is, have the pigments reversed. Now, this can be calculated just by the frequency of these genetic defects. But notice that it's not right to think of the pseudo-normals as genetically defective. The situation is relevantly symmetrical. If a normal person says to a pseudo-normal person, oh, you're defective, you have a combination of two genetic defects, the pseudo-normal person can say to the normal person, oh, well, actually, I think you are defective because there are two genetic defects which lead to color blindness, and either one of them produces color blindness, but both together produce what you have. So the situation is symmetrical. So neither the normal nor the pseudo-normal should be thought of as defective. Now, the last I checked the literature, no pseudo-normal person had ever been examined. Right? We can calculate, because of the frequency of these mutations, that there are 14 in 10,000 people. So, many people in your neighborhood probably are pseudo-normal. Some people, anyway, depending on how big you want to think of your neighborhood is. But they get along well enough so that none of them have ever been looked at enough to find whether they're pseudonormal. So it looks like they have, something like normal color vision. So I surmise that I conclude that we have reason to believe not only that an inverted spectrum is possible, but that something like an inverted spectrum, I don't know exactly how it would differ from an inverted spectrum, may be actual. And that shows that there are qualia. That is, that looking red is an intentional content, not a qualitative content. And notice that nothing in my argument depends on behavioral indistinguishability, right? If we go back to this thing, nothing requires that this guy and this guy be behaviorally indistinguishable. Maybe this guy will say that red things recede and green things come forward, and red things come forward and green things go backward. And this guy will say the reverse. That's not important to the argument. They don't have to be behaviorally indistinguishable for the argument to work. The argument is that neither of them owns external language words, whether or not they're behaviorally distinguishable. So the behavioral distinguishability is irrelevant to the main point. Okay, now the Frege-Schlick objection, and I'll be very brief with this, but I should say that there's a really interesting discussion by Sidney Shoemaker and Bob Stolnaker, and it's referred to in the article of mine that's on my website. So let me say what the Frege-Schlick objection is. The Frege-Schlick objection is we can only, well, it's different, a little bit different to Shoemaker and Stolnaker, but roughly the version that's acceptable to both of them is we can only make sense of inversion within the space of consciousness of a single person. We can't compare experience across people. I can compare two experiences of mine now, but we just can't compare your experience with mine. And Shoemaker claims that both Frege and Schlick endorsed something like this view. Now, I think there's a lot to be said about this view, and Stolnaker has some interesting arguments for it, but there is a very quick argument that it can't be true, or at least that it's kind of what you might call mere skepticism. And I'll give the argument in terms of Hilary Putnam. I gave this paper in Dublin recently at a conference celebrating the 80th birthday of Hilary Putnam. And Hilary mentioned at that conference that things look grayer to him through one eye than the other. And this is a very common phenomenon. And there may be people in this room who have this. You close one eye, you look at a surface, you close one eye and it looks one way, you close the other eye and it looks another way. Okay, but look, suppose we took one of Putnam's eyes and gave them to a blind a person whose eyes had been destroyed, and the other of Putnam's eyes and gave it to another blind person. We have reason to think that those two people would see things differently. Especially if we had some reason to think that the difference between Putnam's color vision and the two eyes had something to do with the eyes themselves. But we saw a lot of reason to think earlier that retinal differences and differences within the lens and other differences within the eye can change color vision. There's every reason to think that some cases in which people's eyes colors are different to people's two eyes are such cases. And so if we transplanted the eyes, we would create a situation where the two people had different color vision. So we'd have reason to think if we gave one of Putnam's eyes to one person, I mean, it's a somewhat ghoulish example, but one of Putnam's eyes to one person and another to the other person, that things would look grayer to one person than the other. So we have reason to think that we can compare qualia in different people. So that's all I'm going to say about the Frege-Schlick objection. Next, a section on whether Wittgenstein would object. Now, first of all, in terms of ineffability, colors, according to what I've said, are only in a way ineffable. So the way in which they're ineffable is this, that there are ways that things look color-wise that are not expressible in terms of standard color terminology, like looks red, looks like a strawberry. However, if you're willing to accept a private language term like Wittgenstein's term, you could say, well, this is the way red things look to me. And so in that way, they're not ineffable. So it's not like there's no way, unless if you were willing to allow a private language anyway, there's no problem. Now, some people would say, and Paul Horwich said in another earlier case where I gave a presentation of this, that the argument I've given presupposes an observational notion of introspection, what Horwich calls the inner arena model. Now, Sidney Shoemaker, an advocate of the inverted spectrum, has actually given some arguments against an observational model that are completely compatible with what I've said, and I agree with all those arguments. So let me just go through them. First of all, perception is fallible in many ways that introspection is not. Even Locke would have agreed with that. In perception, Locke would have agreed that causal signals reliably produce experiences, but in introspection isn't like that. It isn't that experiences reliably, causally produce introspections. There's a more intimate relation between them. Second, perception involves experience of what is perceived, but that there are no experiences of experiences in introspection. So the second way in which the inner arena model, at least if it assumes an observational model of introspection, is not required. There are different perceptual perspectives on the same perceived object, but not different introspective perspectives. Qualitative introspective beliefs include pain. So that is, a pain belief just includes the pain, or at least one kind of pain belief. So it isn't that the pain causes the belief exactly, but it's the pain is part of the pain belief, which isn't true in the case of observation. And also, introspection normally affects the state introspected, whereas it's not so in the case of perception. So look, these are all cases in which I can allow that the observational model is wrong, but that doesn't, at least I claim, if you think I'm wrong, tell me which of these would affect the argument I gave. I don't see that any of these is involved in assuming any of these observational ideas of introspection are involved in my argument. Now, so I've mentioned two things with respect to Wittgenstein. One is the issue of ineffability, and the other is the issue of the observational model. But moving to a different issue, Wittgenstein is notoriously difficult to interpret. Now, I think the orthodox Wittgensteinian would say that Wittgenstein is saying that the hypothesis of qualia is incoherent or otherwise nonsensical. But I think an unorthodox interpretation, probably one that isn't as well supported in the text, would have it that Wittgenstein is agnostic about qualia and is claiming only that language does not and or cannot express qualia, which isn't to say that qualia don't exist. So take the famous beetle in the box argument. He says, suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. No one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. Now notice that he doesn't, if you think of the beetle in the box as the analog of qualia, notice that he's not saying there is nothing in the box. He's saying that the thing in the box has no place in the language game. Right? It's that whatever is in the box, if something is isn't involved in the language game. It is involved in talking about your experience or about colors. So that is compatible with qualia existing, but not being things that have a role in the language game, which is approximately the view that I've argued that qualia, we should take qualia as having. That is, as underlying our ability to say that something is red or white, but not being the thing to which ordinary language terms are keyed. So I think there is a case to be made. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about Wittgenstein to be sure how strong it is, that Wittgenstein actually should be understood as agnostic about qualia. Let me move to the last section of the paper, the issue of memory. So here is a way of understanding the inverted spectrum situation in diagram. So we have the eye seeing a red thing. The person says red. That was stage 1. And there's an experience which at one point I labeled as the R experience. So this is the process intervening between the eye and the mouth. Now at stage 2, the subject has had his wires crossed. We can symbolize that schematically with this object. Stage 3, according to the way I was thinking about it, there is some further change in the brain of the speaker, so that compensates for the first one. He sees a red thing, it looks the way green things used to look to him, but because of this change, instead of saying green, he says it's red. Now, a memory skeptic might say, well, how do you know it's not like this? How do you know there's not a compensating change earlier in the system, so things actually still look to him the same way that they did? And in fact, Dennett gives such an argument, and he says there's no way to distinguish this case from this case. You could not empirically distinguish them, and Dennett also says the subject could not introspectively distinguish them. So the difference makes no sense. Now, this does presuppose a kind of verificationism, which I won't comment on further, but let me argue that there's no reason to believe we could not find out about such a change. So here is a version of these hypotheses more elaborated. So in the cases I'm thinking of it, we have the eye looking at there's the crossed wires, there's the experience. This is at stage 3 and 4. And then there's a comparator that compares with a memory image. And the comparison comes out different. So the subject says, looks different from before I had the operation. Now here's the skeptical hypothesis. So you've got the compensating inversion here. These things, the red things actually look the way red things used to look. But something has gone wrong with the memory. So when the memory is compared with with this thing, they do look different. And the subject says they look different, but the memory is different in a way that you can't compare except by comparing with what you have now. But look, once you make it so specific, you can see that there's no reason to think that normal empirical methods could not detect it. We could look at the memory representation in the brain and see whether it had changed from here. Now somebody might say that this presupposes that there is some distinction between memory representations and current visual representations. But we have every reason to think that there is such a distinction. At least they're distinct to some extent. So there's no reason to think we could not make the comparison. Here's another way. So there's no reason to think that we could not get an empirical handle on this. Here's a different kind of memory skeptic, which is the same as before, only this time the qualia and the memory are the same, but something is wrong in the comparator. So the subject says it looks different when they really aren't different. Again, we could investigate this process. So once you get specific about how the comparison is supposed to go wrong, then it begins to look like it is possible to investigate it. So let me remind you that what I've done. So I have I've given you the innocuous and the dangerous inverted spectrum hypotheses. I introduced that principle of normality, which says if the two inverted people are normal, there's no saying that the word red goes better with one than the other. I introduced the Shoemaker's distinction. Then I gave a shifted spectrum argument on the basis of there being more differences in color phenomenology than in color behavior. Then the inverted spectrum argument, I mentioned the Frege-Schlick argument and gave that Putnam 2I argument against. Then I gave you various different considerations about Wittgenstein, and then mentioned the issue of memory. And that's the end.
I'm going to sum up what I understood.
Okay, sure.
But in French, okay?
Yeah, okay.
Pour que ça puisse servir à quelque chose, je vais... Alors, sous le contrôle de Ned et peut-être de vous, et après je poserai en anglais une question à Ned. Voilà ce que j'ai compris du propos de Ned. Il s'agit d'utiliser d'une façon nouvelle un argument, je crois, classique en faveur des qualia, qui est l'argument du spectre inversé des couleurs, sauf qu'il l'a réinterprété d'une façon tout à fait nouvelle. Il l'a interprété à partir d'abord d'une comparaison entre deux textes de Wittgenstein, un qui introduit l'idée d'une inversion, enfin en fait il n'y a pas tout à fait d'inversion dans les deux textes, mais on va faire comme si c'était une inversion entre la perception du rouge et du vert chez deux sujets, dans un cas qui est jugé bénin, dans un cas qui est jugé au contraire dangereux, et Ned ne fait pas l'interprétation habituelle, je crois, que l'on fait d'habitude entre les deux cas, où on dit que dans un cas ce qui est dangereux c'est que c'est indétectable, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a une question d'ineffable, alors que son interprétation, c'est que dans un cas, dans le cas bénin, l'inversion se produit dans un cas où il y a conscience d'anormalité. Alors que le cas qui est dangereux, c'est lorsque les deux paires sont dans le cas de sujets normaux ou jugés normaux. Et tout son argument, ces deux arguments empiriques, vont consister à montrer on peut prouver qu'il y a cette inversion alors qu'il y a sujets normaux. Est-ce que tout le monde a compris ça? Bon. Alors, il introduit un certain nombre de nouveaux concepts, qui sont d'abord les concepts de Shoemaker, la différence entre contenu intentionnel et contenu qualitatif, qui à mon avis est essentiel, évidemment, pour son propos. Et je crois qu'il y a eu aussi l'introduction d'un concept de Frege, qui permet d'introduire la différence entre avoir l'air blanc et avoir l'air d'être blanc, c'est-à-dire quelque chose qui a un fondement objectif, qui est, semble-t-il, un argument de Frege contre les qualia. Je n'ai pas remarqué, mais peut-être me trompais-je, que ce nouveau concept influe indirectement sur le centre de l'exposé, qui est au fond l'exposé de deux expériences de pensée, mais qui ont une base empirique. La première expérience, c'est celle de l'argument du spectre qui a changé, et le second, c'est du spectre qui est véritablement inversé, comme dans l'expérience de pensée, je crois, qui est plus classique. Dans le premier cas, ça consiste simplement, le premier argument consiste essentiellement à montrer qu'il peut y avoir ce que tout le monde reconnaît, une variation dans la base neuronale de la phénoménologie de la vision entre hommes et femmes, ou entre différentes ethnies, ou à différents âges. Et donc l'argument consiste à dire que dans tous ces cas, première prémisse, il s'agit de genres normaux. La seconde prémisse est que par ailleurs, On sait qu'il y a une influence sociale ou linguistique dans l'usage que nous avons des termes de couleur, pour des besoins de mais que pour des besoins de communication, on emploie un certain nombre de termes limités, et par conséquent, la conclusion, c'est que on peut avoir le même contenu intentionnel de telle ou telle couleur, alors que le contenu qualitatif, on peut le montrer, est différent chez l'homme et chez la femme, ou dans différentes ethnies ou à différents âges. La deuxième expérience de pensée, mais qui a un fondement empirique, utilise l'inversion et pas simplement le changement dans le spectre des couleurs, mais une véritable inversion, comme dans l'expérience classique entre rouge et vert. Et donc ça consiste à montrer qu'on peut imaginer 4 stades différents chez un même sujet, chez un seul et même sujet. À 18 ans, il voit le rouge-rouge. À 18 ans, il y a un jour, brusquement, il s'est passé quelque chose, il voit rouge-vert. Et bon, il dit c'est vert, mais il y a une aberration. À l'âge de 50 ans, il voit toujours vert, mais il utilise cette fois-ci la bonne terminologie. Donc, et puis, il y a une amnésie, et dans l'étape numéro 4, il voit toujours vert, il voit toujours vert, nous savons qu'il voit toujours vert, mais comme il a tout à fait oublié ce qu'il voyait auparavant, à l'âge de 18 ans, il n'a plus aucun sentiment de voir différemment, de voir ce qu'il ne faut pas voir, et par conséquent, il utilise complètement, de façon correcte les termes. Nous savons qu'il voit vert, et il emploie rouge et vert tout à fait comme il faut. Si bien qu'il n'y a aucune manière de distinguer l'étape 1 de l'étape 4. Voilà comment j'ai compris l'argument. Je ne sais pas si vous l'avez compris d'une façon différente de moi. Il y a un troisième argument qui utilise des questions de différences génétiques, des cas pathologiques qui sont supposés justement, dont la question est de savoir si on peut les détecter, qui sont dans 14 cas sur 10 000, et puis il répond à 2 objections, une objection disons, Frege-Schlick, il réinterprète d'une nouvelle façon le texte de Wittgenstein, en disant que, d'une façon non orthodoxe, en disant que finalement le texte de Wittgenstein pourrait ne pas s'interpréter dans un sens considérant que Wittgenstein doutait de l'existence des qualia, mais plutôt dans le sens suivant que Wittgenstein serait agnostique sur l'existence ou non des qualia, mais simplement affirmerait d'une façon sceptique que le langage ne peut jamais détecter ou dire ces qualia. Voilà l'essentiel de ce que j'ai compris. Je ne sais pas si vous êtes d'accord avec ce que j'ai compris. I don't know if you understood what I understood in your talk, but I want to make only one question. I think the argument are very persuasive, but I thought that the traditional inverted spectrum argument consisted in showing that there are qualitative content, or maybe there is a difference in qualitative content with the same physical basis. And what the argument is that there is same intentional content with difference in qualitative content. But there is not, in your argument, there is not the same physical or bodily content. So is this qualia in the traditional meaning? This is my first question.
Well, you're certainly right that some people use the inverted spectrum argument to argue for dualism.
Yes.
And it's the same. There's an ambiguity, I guess, in the hypothesis, just as
But
there is with
your argument is completely monist.
Yes, that's right. Yes, the ambiguity is the same one that exists in the notion of a zombie.
Yeah.
As some people mean when they talk about zombies, that you're talking about two creatures that are physically exactly alike, but there's mentality in one and no mentality in the other. And similarly, some people think of the inverted spectrum in the way that you described. David Chalmers uses it in the way that you describe. Now, what Locke had in mind, I don't know. I think Locke is supposed to be the first person to talk about it in print. Certainly, it's much more plausible to think of the one where they're physically different, where the physical difference explains the qualitative difference. I myself think that this sort of inverted spectrum really pits functionalism against physicalism. So my version is completely monist, but it's anti-functionalist.
Yes. Okay. But what is a function?
A function is the causal role of the
Is this a
color
linguistic
experience.
function?
No, it's the causal role of the experience in the mental economy of the subject. It is what we use. It includes, just the sort of very simplest part, reacting to red things by saying they're red, expressing the view by saying that I'm seeing a red thing, but also in comparisons among colored things, or answering questions like, which is your favorite color? So there's a role that color experiences have in your mental economy. So that and the idea of the functionalist view is that role can be used to capture what the experiences really are. So this argument says that two experiences with different qualitative character might have the same role, and so it can be used to argue against that. But the argument I'm giving is really directed towards this ineffability issue, the qualia issue. So and it's really key to the Wittgensteinian idea that experience should be capturable in language. And so I'm using it to argue not against functionalism, but for the idea that there might be features of experience. In fact, that there possibly are, and maybe really are. There's some evidence that there are features of experience which are not capturable in language in that way.
Okay. Qui a une question?
Are you good to recognize people?
Huh?
Are you good? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your exposition. And I got very much interested by your example of eye transplant. And I'd like to know if you have further information to give us, for example, about if there is any difference of perception from people who got, especially two different people with different sexes that got the same, got the eyes from the same person. And how that could...
The eye transplant was meant to be an entirely science fiction example. I don't know whether there can be an eye transplant. Does anybody know?
Oh, I'm sorry, but what I thought is, because I thought a little bit about your example, and how could that interfere in the perception of people from different sexes concerning the problem of different genes that you mentioned before.
Oh, yeah.
So I asked myself, how could that influence? I mean, two different people got one eye, each one, and they from different sexes getting this, but the donor of the eyes is just one. So I just wonder if that really could, if you could have more information to give us concerning the effects of perception that could make.
Okay, I'm not completely clear on the question. So there are these genetic differences between people and average differences between men and women. So if you took one person and took their two eyes out, if you could transplant them into another person, I don't know if it can really be done. Whether there's a difference would depend on those individual eyes and not on whether it's a man or a woman. So I'm not clear how the... So you're thinking of... so look, maybe what you're thinking of as a woman where the... So as I said, it's random which X chromosome is activated in a woman. So maybe a woman's two eyes could be activated differently. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yes, I've been wondering how that could affect in their perception. Especially because a lot of people also think that the brain plays a role, that it's more important than the eye itself.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things to think about it too. For example, there are a lot of people say that basically it's believed that we can't survive without a brain.
Yeah.
And there is a baby in Brazil, for example, that it survives for 6 months.
Yeah.
And it suffers and it feels pain and it feels a lot of problem perception that we say they're not able to without a brain. So I've just wondered if there are some scientific research that had already discussed this and analyzed it.
Yeah. So the last point you're making, you're thinking of these anencephalic babies? That is, babies who are born without a cortex?
There is one now.
No, there are. But they're not born without a brain. They're born without a cortex. So the cerebral cortex is just part of the brain. So there are this horrible syndrome called anencephaly, in which babies are born without a cortex, but they can survive a certain period and seem much like normal infants, but that's because normal infants don't have much of their cortex connected. So I don't know if I've got what you're talking about right.
Ned, this is continuing with the eyes. So we don't know from, perhaps you know because perhaps he told you when Hillary got the change in eye, but suppose he had eyes of that difference, Qualia difference all along.
Yeah, I think that's the case.
Well, then would it be right for him to say one is grayer? I mean, wouldn't he be in the position of your kind of stage 4 guy? I mean, wouldn't he be saying, well, why should I say one of the eyes is grayer? Why shouldn't I say one eye is getting true red and the other part of me thinks, well, the other eye is getting true red, and I'm in this kind of locked-in struggle as to which eye I should, I want to use the metaphor, listen to for settling my view of red, no?
Well, I think for some cases it is. People can make that comparison, but if the two eyes were inverted, one with respect to the other, you couldn't use grayer. If they're nearby on a spectrum, and one, it's a difference of so you can say where they are in that color space, but I think they needn't be comparable in a linguistic way.
But to say one's a grayer kind of red is to suggest he knows which eye's getting it right, no? And why isn't that question begging?
Yeah, well, I don't know what... whether he would say that one is getting it right, I don't know. Maybe he would say he doesn't know which is true, which is the truer red. But I'm not saying there aren't any comparisons that can be made in this shifted spectrum thing. I just think that there will be some where no comparison can be made.
I heard last year from comparisons by my woman who is a doctor in philosophy. She had an operation of her eye lens. When she was younger, she had 2 different eyes with 2 different kinds of sensibility. And the surgeon decided to turn both eyes to normal normal for the surgeon. So she went out furious because out of two different eyes, she had two eyes which were supposed the same. So we had to go through a cloakroom, and I had to discuss color of garments for each piece of garment she had bought, whether it was black or blue or navy blue or whatsoever. So in this case, it was an experience, and with somebody who had the intellectual level to describe it with precision. But what I want to remark on Qualia is that, in fact, introspection experiences are based on a record, like an experience. But the record of introspection is based on what you remember. So it's based on a time lag between what you actually experience and language. This is not in the machine. The machine, the colors are set by numbers, and there is no time lag between what you experience and language. So the time lag can do something which is what is easy to remember and uneasy to remember. Uneasy to remember talks a kind of Darwinism between experiences.
So on the first point, it sounds like the woman you're talking about had to relearn color language. So she's a good illustration of the point that I was making about how we have the point about how we have the same color space where borders have to be imposed from outside. Now the second point, I'm not sure if I really got the point.
It's about time lags.
Time lags, yeah.
The significance of time.
Yeah. So are you expressing skepticism about
Perception and language.
Yeah. Well, I agree that there is.
What is pleasant,
Mm-hmm.
you tell it. What is unpleasant, you don't tell it. So this is Darwin, Charles Darwin.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And I don't want to go back to Robert Flagg, who said about science, which is out, and art, which is inside.
I see. Okay. Well, I think I agree with that.
Okay, I have basically three questions. I'll start at one point in your talk, you seem to be saying that perceptual verbs, like when I say that something looks red to me, you seem to say that that kind of verbs are always used in their conceptual as opposed to phenomenal sense. You said that when somebody says, this tomato looks red to me, this means this tomato looks to be red to me. Is that right?
I did say approximately. The point I was trying to make, this is not meant to be a linguistic analysis. The point I was trying to make is that if I was talking about Frege saying that we sometimes use color words objectively. He's implying we sometimes use them subjectively. Sometimes we use them to refer to properties of objects. Sometimes we use to refer to the property of our sensations. So my point was that when we use them to describe our sensations, that it's parasitic on the use to describe objects, the color properties of objects in the world. That when we say something looks red, we are saying something that depends on which objects we take to be red. That is, saying of our experience that it looks red it depends, that word red gets its reference even as applied subjectively via the colors of objects. So I was saying that both the internal and the external uses are, in a certain important way, objective.
Okay, but you wouldn't say that I can use the word looks in the phenomenal sense and yet be mistaken about what my phenomenal state is.
Can I be mistaken?
Yeah.
Okay, so I generally think one can be mistaken, and not just a verbal mistake, but that really is a different topic. I mean, I think there are some persuasive examples, I think, in the literature of where people are mistaken about their own experience because of self-deception. They're motivated to think they're having one experience when really they're having another.
Okay, second question. You said that qualia cannot be expressed in language. But look, I can say, referring to my own experience, this is how my experience, say, of the world behind you, this is how this looks to me.
Yes, how this thing looks to me. And I did say, I'll show you the slide, if I can find it. Remember I had that slide about ineffability? Where is that? Yes, right here. So I said that qualia are in a way ineffable, in a way not ineffable, and this is an example much like yours. So I think they're not ineffable in that one can refer to them. I used the distinction between referring and expressing in language. So what I mean by that is you can say, the qualia I'm having right now, or the qualia given to me by that wall, as you say. Expressing is what is using the terms for properties of objects to say, for example, this looks red to me. So that's what I think you can't do. So I think they're a way ineffable and a way not ineffable.
Okay. Does their ineffability in some sense has to do with the fact that I can only, pick out the qualia demonstratively and not descriptively?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So third question. You use the word and the concept of normality several times in your talk. How exactly, could you come back on how you would make the distinction between normal and abnormal cases? Because it seems to me that at one point you extend the range of the normal cases so much that how would you then define abnormal cases if genetic troubles does not lead to abnormal cases, if sex, age, race difference? So.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So I would key them to this dialectic. That is, if one person says red things look red to me and green to you, and if the other person can reasonably answer, who says you are the one for whom red things look red, that gives you an idea of what I'm counting as normal. I haven't given a definition of normal, but the importance of normality for me is its use in that argument. So I'm just relying on a rough and ready appreciation of it, where there can be genetic differences. Now, my claim, remember, was that the pseudonormal person is not genetically defective. That the relation between the pseudonormal and the normal is a symmetrical relation.
Not exactly, since you have really an overwhelming majority of people who doesn't suffer from this genetic abnormality. So
here's the question. If we regard the pseudonormals as abnormal and say that they see red things as green, what do we say when they're then in the majority? Can we say that suddenly they see red things as red and we see them as green? It doesn't seem reasonable to say that. And so I think the right thing to say is that the numbers don't count.
Okay. And in this case, I just want to make sure that your definition of normality, referring to this slide, doesn't have to, has nothing to do with the behavioral, distinguishability and indistinguishability, which you said that is not really significant.
Well, my point is that if red recedes for this guy and comes forward for this guy, then the question is which of those is normal? So even if there's some behavioral way to tell them apart, there's still the issue of which behavior is normal. And the same issue arises for that.
Okay, thanks.
So on this issue of expressibility, I'm not sure I exactly understand your notion of expressibility. You sort of defined it just now, but I'd like you to say more about it. So my problem is that it's possible to refer, you said, to Qualia. We can refer to them demonstratively, and we can describe them, and we can also, you admitted in the talk that it's also possible to introduce them into intentional content, modes of presentation, and you said that it only muddies the waters, you say something like that, as if it did not have any impact on the argument if we did so. So given all this claim about unexpressibility seems unclear to me. So can you again define this term, express? You say
the thing that I mainly want to rely on is that, okay, so we have phenomenal states, visual states, seeing some, visual experience, auditory experience, bodily sensations, pain, etc. When we talk about the contents of those states, typically we can make distinctions between the contents only by appealing to properties of objects. So we can say for pains that this is a sharp pain, a dull, thudding pain. So we're adverting to the kind of thing that would produce it or something like that. In the case of color or texture, we can say it feels rough, it feels smooth. We're talking about the way certain things feel. So we're designating the type of sensation via appeal to properties of objects. So what I'm saying is that there are features of experience that cannot be, there are contents of experience that cannot be so referred to, so expressed. Although I agree that we can use language to pick those things out in other ways.
And about modes of presentations, what difference would that make if one insisted that intentional content is a bit more complex, it's not purely referential, there are these layers, and we sort of refer to properties via modes of presentation? Someone would insist that Qualia have a role to play at that level.
Well, I'm happy with that, but it just makes the way of talking about, I used the Shoemaker distinction between intentional and qualitative content by way of expositing.
Would it survive? Would that distinction survive the introduction of Qualia into modes of presentation?
Yes, because but one would have to circumlocute. So one would say, okay, there's a kind of content which is keyed to an aspect of intentional content, namely the referential aspect. The point is that the existence of Qualia is, we could think of it in this way. So there's this view sometimes called representationism or representationalism or intentionalism, that the content of experience can be captured by the representational or intentional content. Now, if you include qualitative properties in those intentional contents, then the existence of a certain disagreement will be harder to state. The disagreement between people who believe in qualia that are not a matter of properties represented. So instead, you'd have to talk about color representing intentional content or the referential aspect of intentional content. So I think everything could be stated, and all the same disagreements could be stated using that terminology. It would just be a bit, more lengthy. Do you think that's not the case?
I'm not sure I understood the last argument against Qualia and eliminative instrumentalism. So Dennett says that at stage 3 in the evolution, we can tell there is a vagueness. We can't really tell if the person switched and has the same intentional content or not. And you say, well, there is an empirical distinction. We could find the neural basis of this phenomenological difference. But then, in that case, do we really have the dangerous inverted spectrum, or is it not just another case of the innocuous case? If we really have a physical, if we can check, if we have public criteria or scientific criteria to check the difference, that means that we don't have a dangerous case.
Well, you remember the difference between the dangerous and the okay, so there was the issue that I started with, what the difference was between the dangerous and the non-dangerous case. So I keyed it to this passage from Wittgenstein, where he says, why should it not be always the case? Now, I think the problem for Wittgenstein would be if there are ways of experiencing red which are not capturable in terms of ordinary criteria. If those ways can be only determined by science, I think Wittgenstein would the problem would arise. Now, I also said that it may be, on a somewhat adventurous interpretation of Wittgenstein of the beetle in the box, that actually he would be happy with it as long as it was acknowledged that they don't play any role in the ordinary color talk language game. But the idea of the dangerous inverted spectrum was key to Wittgenstein and key to this idea that it doesn't play any role in ordinary discourse. Now, ordinary discourse could change if we had little, brainoscopes that we could use to see whether people's spectra were inverted or something. But as things are now, without the brainoscopes, I think the kind of possibility I mentioned would be an example of a dangerous inversion.
So it means that your notion of qualia doesn't include anything like the usual distinction between first person, third person point of view. I mean, it doesn't really retain something like that. If I have rightly understood what you.
Well, as Francis mentioned, I am a monist, a physicalist.
Yeah.
So, being a physicalist, I think that first-person entities can be detected, examined, compared by people other than the subject. So, in that sense, I think there isn't a first-person, third-person distinction. But in another way, of course, there is such a distinction because the subjective qualities are subjective qualities for a person, and that is the person who has them.
Yes, but
and
if
that
we
person
have a
knows about them
brainoscope,
from a first-person point of view. He doesn't need a brainoscope. Okay. So I agree that there is a first-person, third-person distinction, but if you're a physicalist, you don't think it's as significant as anti-physicalists might think.
Okay, thank you.
How is it possible for physicalists? How would it be possible to prove that qualia do not exist?
For a physicalist?
Yes. Would it be possible to prove it? Can
Well,
you imagine a proof? Imagine.
You could certainly imagine an argument, or physicalist arguments against the kinds of cases that I gave, against the shifted spectrum and inverted spectrum. You can imagine a physicalist argument that there is no discrepancy between experience and its functional role. So you can certainly imagine these problem cases being shown by physicalist science to be mistaken, science fiction but not real. Now, whether the mere possibility, I would argue that the mere possibility shows the existence of qualia. Now, but I haven't said anything about what kind of possibility that is. And now what I think is that it's really metaphysical possibility rather than nomological possibility. So if that's right, then the arguments would actually be immune to scientific refutation. Well, a certain kind of scientific refutation, but I think I stayed away from the issue of what kind of possibility it is because I think it's a really difficult problem that I'm not sure I have an answer to.
Bon, y a-t-il d'autres questions? Il nous reste à remercier Ned pour cet exposé extrêmement suggestif qui intéressait aussi bien les amateurs de psychologie que les plus métaphysiciens d'entre nous.